greater public understanding about religion and present the contributions of people of all faiths and diverse religious and spiritual communities. The program also received federal support from the Latino Initiatives Pool, administered by the National Museum of the American Latino, and the Asia Pacific American Initiatives Pool, administered by the Smithsonian Asia Pacific American Center. The festival strives to maintain an accessible and inclusive environment for all visitors of all abilities. If you are in need of accessible seating options or assistive listening during this presentation, please see our venue managing volunteer wearing a button that says, "Ask Me," and they will help you. Detailed accessibility information about all of our festival accessibility services, including ASL interpretation, audio description, real-time captioning, and a variety of other services can be found on the festival website or by visiting the information booth in that direction over there. With that, it is my pleasure to serve today as the MC for our conversation about Indigenous Epistemologies. And so my name is Healoha Johnston. I am the Director of Cultural Resources and the Curator for Hawaiian Pacific Arts and Culture at Bishop Museum. And it is my honor to be able to introduce our guest, our panelists today. Our honored speakers are joining 2 in person as well as 3 via Zoom. And so I wanted to start by introducing our panelists, our participants who are joining hybrid. You can see them here behind me. And I'll start, and if I may ask as speakers on Zoom, if you would please wave when I introduce you so that folks here can know who you are. I'll start by introducing Clara Bisa, who is a master weaver and member of the Marshallese community living in Arkansas. She weaves mats and transmits this artistic knowledge by teaching other women to weave. Clara oversees the weaving of the sails for Marshallese canoes, including those that have been built by her husband, master carver Litha Bisa. Second participant is Litha Ralpho. She is the coordinator for the Ozarks Marshallese Canoe Program here at the Smithsonian Folklife Festival. She is a career coordinator working across disciplines to support overall well-being of the Marshallese diaspora in education, healthcare, and arts and culture sectors. Her administrative abilities, combined with her knowledge of fiber arts, enabled her to orchestrate the acquisition of natural materials, such as pandanus leaves, to support the creation of artworks made by Marshallese practitioners during the festival. Our third participant is Louisa Solawin, and she is a member of the Arkansas Coalition of Marshallese, where she works to empower Marshallese community members through culturally sensitive programming, education, and policy advocacy. She is multilingual and supports the Marshallese language and English language translations in Arkansas, as well as here for the festival. And then here in person joining us, we have 2 participants. Kuma Ramsay Tom, sitting here, thank you, Kuma, is the founder and president of the Hawaii-based Life Enhancement Institute, or LAY for short, of the Pacific. His eclectic background and experience spans business, government, and community service across both public and private sectors. He also supports for-profit and nonprofit businesses. His work in promoting sustainable, place-based, and Hawaiian cultural stewardship principles and practices is acknowledged locally, nationally, and internationally. Trained by respected Hawaiian elders, he effectively integrates place-based, cultural-based, Indigenous and Native Hawaiian cultural values and principles into contemporary business. Kuma Ramsay is helping us integrate customary Hawaiian philosophy and practices into our programs at the festival this week and next. Also joining us is Nathan Samayo, here on the stage with us.
Kapade.
Thank you. He was born in Guahan and raised in Tacoma, Washington. He is currently a PhD student at Princeton Theological Seminary, focusing on technology, ecology, and oceanic epistemology and intellectual history. He recently obtained a Master of Divinity at Harvard, focusing on religion and decolonial thought in Pacific Island diaspora. He's also worked as a research intern for the Oceanic collections at Harvard Peabody Museum and was a coordinator for the AAPI Studies Working Group for Harvard's Committee on Ethnicity, Migration, and Rights. And Nathan says he's very grateful to share today about Pacific Islander epistemology within the diaspora. So with that, I'm going to join the group here on this stage and start off the conversation. And thank you all for joining us.
Awesome, thank you.
Mahalo.
I want to start today's conversation, by stating just some information about the nature of our conversation. And it is really based on oceanic ecologies and epistemologies. And so epistemologies is one of these words that people often wonder, what does that really mean? You hear it. And my understanding of epistemologies, just to sort of put it out there, is that it is a theory about knowledge. It's what we think we know about what we know. Yes?
Absolutely.
And so today I'm going to be inviting the panelists to describe how they know what they know, and to also maybe expand a little bit on how Indigenous epistemologies are often described for their relationality, the interconnectedness of everything as part of a framework for epistemologies within the Pacific. And so maybe, can I start with you, Kuma Ramsay?
Sure.
And I'm just going to ask you, what do you think epistemology is, and how do you see it living around you and you in it?
Well, thank you for that question, but more importantly, thanks to the Smithsonian for inviting us here and inviting us to have this conversation, because I think it's an important one where we are in the world today. Because maybe an oversimplified way of responding, it's a worldview. How we see the world compared to how others see the world. There's another term called a paradigm, the belief systems that we have. And it really is a reflection of our relationships to our particular places, and in particular our food. If you subscribe to the idea that we are what we eat. But the epistemology really goes back to, where did we come from? Who are we? How did we get here? Because then it helps us figure out where we're going to go. And I think for those of us that live in islands in the ocean, we have a different worldview. We're in the ocean, not on it, which actually shifts the way we relate to it. So to your term of relations, I like to think that from the Pacific Island view or island worldview, we operate off of relationships, not transactions. Yet we live in a world that is fundamentally driven by transactions. And so consequently, we measure our progress, our success, with a different metric, which is relational. It has more to do with belonging than it does with belongings. It's more accountability driven than it is accounting driven. And these are the ways that I think we begin to interact with our environment, as well as our colleagues, wherever they may be. So that's a kind of a big answer for a short question.
Thank you. I want to, invite Nathan here to respond to that. In particular, Kuma Ramsay introduced the idea of that connection to place and the sense of belonging. And for you, as somebody who is from Guam but was raised on the continental U.S., how do you situate yourself within these different epistemologies?
Yeah, absolutely. Half a day, everyone. Sizil's Ma'asi, thank you for having me here. It's a delight to even be on stage with these folks and our Marshallese family on Zoom. Yeah, so just to give some context about where I'm entering in this conversation, because it's very important when entering these very sacred convos to state your positionality. That being said, so I was born in Guam, also known as Guam, and due to very unfortunate events that I can't necessarily say in public, that had to do with drugs. It's called Kek on the island. My family had to leave Guam. And because of that, there's a big Pacific Islander community in Washington State, which is where I grew up. And a lot of how I know about Chamorro culture, which is the culture of people from Guahan, I was in a hula group for 8 years. And in that hula group, we learned ancient stories, so the Chamorro origin story. We learned how to speak Chamorro. And it was called Famagoan Itanu is what we called ourselves. And that kind of translates to, it's kind of hard to translate some of these words to English, but like children of the land. So Famagoan meaning like children and Tanu meaning land. That being said, so my family, we actually stopped doing hula when I was at the age of 12. And as I started thinking about this word epistemology, right, so the ways that we understand the world, as I've been in school, I've been really recognizing how much, as a Pacific Islander in the continent, you're just indoctrinated with American propaganda, hyper-militarism, right? Because there's always an international threat going on somewhere, as they like to say within the American propaganda kind of discourse. And really, the reliance on extraction and consumerism, that really is not healthy and is leading to the destruction of the planet. And being in the US and the colonial metropole, the Pacific has been has been extracted so much. There's a lot of history that we can get into, but for the sake of time, I'll keep it at that. And for me, I've been trying to find myself outside of a Western epistemology, right? I think that's where this is why I feel like this conversation is so sacred. Been trying to find myself outside of a Western imperial epistemology of extraction and militarism because of the existential crises that we're in right now in this current time and for a long time now. And for that, speaking on the relationship to land, one of the kind of cultural values in Guahan, and it's used in different contexts and it means different things, but I'll explain it from my perspective, is this value of what they call inafamalek. So inafamalek meaning, famalek meaning like to make right or to make peace, right? And it's this idea of sustainable relationships, right? And how I like to think about it is because of the origin stories of Guahan, which is called Fu'una Zampuntan, which I won't get into just yet. It's really this idea that our ancestors have turned into the land, right? And if we want to respect our elders, we have to respect the land. And within a Western epistemology, land and human bodies are separated. And that's just not the case within Pacific Island, I'll say Guahan epistemology, which we are literally of the land, right? And you kind of said you are what you eat, which is exactly the case. And to respect my elders, I must respect the land because that's how the land was formed, was through our elders' bodies. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much, Nathan.
Yeah.
I want to invite our speakers who are joining us via Zoom. Wondering if maybe Clara or Litha or Luisa want to talk about how your origin stories from the Marshall Islands inform the way that you continue your weaving practices and how you respond to being in a very different context on the continental US and what that means for how you maintain your practice of weaving and gathering.
So if you don't mind, can you explain what exactly you're asking? Because at the beginning, we're getting cut off. We're having bad sound system, and it's finally working now.
Thank you. I'm sorry about that. I think maybe if you folks could describe how you have been able to maintain your practice that relies on natural materials that are often found in the Pacific, but you live now in Arkansas. And so how you are able to maintain your practices and continue with the stories and the customary practices that you know and bring for future generations of Marshallese folks now living in the diaspora.
All right, thank you for the question. So it is a bit different. Our practices living out here in the U.S. and Arkansas is different from back home. Stuff that we use back home, we rarely have it out here in the U.S. For example, coconut leaves that we use back home, pandanus leaves to weave stuff like our mats, our headpieces, and all that. Also, the traditions are different from back home to what we do here, but we still use those traditions here in Arkansas. It's just some of the stuff that we have back home, we don't have it here. So some of the stuffs are kind of hard for us to do back here. We usually, if we need to do stuffs like weave mats and stuff, we usually order them back home and they'll send it here to Arkansas.
So you maintain that connection through the materials that are then transported and shipped.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. A lot of this is centering around these ecologies, right? These systems of movement of people, movement of materials. And I'm wondering maybe if Kuma Ramsay, you could speak first about how you see that happening in Hawaii and how people, can participate in what I think is, people have talked a lot about allyship, but then moving allyship towards accomplice, which is like people seeing themselves in the action that is necessary in order to build and restore those relationships to the land and a place.
No, I think that's a great question, especially in the world of a more globalized world, where we're all impacted by the delivery systems, the supply chains, etc. I think to best or better explain it, I have to pick up on something that was said earlier by Nathan as well as our colleagues on the screen. It goes back to our identity and to our place, the ecology, which is in us. And had you asked one of our elders multiple generations ago who they were, who are you? Unlike today, most people will give you their names and give you the title of whatever they do. My name is John and I'm a doctor, which is, from a language standpoint, human, it's noun, predicate, predicate, noun, switching around, which is my name, but that doesn't tell you who you are. And maybe even my profession might give you an insight of who I am, but it doesn't really say who you are. What I'm getting to is that our kupuna, our elders would say, hey Hawaii. And in the definition, it says, I am Hawaii. The reason we say I am Hawaii, because it says, I eat her and she eats me. Fundamentally, what Nathan was talking about is that my ancestors were in this ground. When I return to the ground, my descendants will benefit from my relationship and their relationship. What it really speaks to is that our identity, who we are, comes from those places. The clothes we wear, the language we speak, the songs we sing, the art, our technology is all reflective of our place. It's grown out of the ground. And you can take any place in the world, start with the letter A, Arizona, Australia, Austria. Doesn't matter. If you begin to look at the cultures that are of those places, their homes are a reflection of the resources that are there. Their clothing, the resources that were there. So fundamentally, we are a reflection. We are a product of our particular places. That's changing now. And what I mean by that is that there's a generation of Native Hawaiians, Kanaka Maoli, who live in Hawaii, who may not be able to say He Hawaiiao in several generations because the majority of our food comes from somewhere else. It's imported. It no longer grows out of the ground. And I like to suggest that globally we are more like an island now than we ever been. For the practice that most of our foods, I think many of you in the audience would agree that many of the foods, even our energy, is coming from someplace else. It doesn't really come from our communities anymore. So consequently, at some point in time, our identities begin to change because we're no longer relating to our places in the way that we did when we first came to those places. So in as much as we might say there's a Western thought process, when you live on a globe, a ball, there's always someone more West than you. And so what we have to think about is what is the ethos, what's the ethics that really created the condition of thought that allows us to prioritize importing other things rather than growing it ourselves. There's an ethos behind that. It's an economic ethos. It's not an ecological one. That economic ethos has changed our relationship with our ecologies. And so consequently, that is also changing who we are, not just as islanders on an island called Oahu or Hawaii, but on the island called Earth, where all of us are at some point indigenous to that place. And our relationships to our places have changed simply because of the supply chain and because of the economics. And I think for those of us that are trying to retain our indigeneity, our indigenous identities, it's reconnecting, rebuilding those relationships to those resources. And unfortunately, in some cases, those resources have been damaged forever. And so we're having to replace them or restore them in different ways. So, and I think it is events like this that begins to allow us to share and understand what makes up who we are as a global family, an island family, and how we can learn from one another, but also more importantly, how to learn to help ourselves, especially for those of us who have undergone a diaspora, where we no longer know our places or our ancestors, right? And how do we recover something that we don't know? And so I think, again, I think this event is one of those, places that we can really begin to explore that. So thank you for this panel and the opportunity. I hope that made some sense. Yeah.
Should I just hop into this real quick? I mean, Uncle Kumu, thank you. And in the bio of this this panel, it said intergenerational conversation. And so I appreciate sharing the stage with all of you as well. And we also have they're called the Mononku. The Mononku are the elderly in our culture, and they're the ones who have wisdom. Not just, cultural and ecological wisdom, but also food wisdom. So, you always got to butter up your Mononku. That being said, this is a little bit on the pessimistic side. But I was thinking about, because I'm a techno-pessimist. That's what, people consider me as. That being said, I think the unfortunate reality is, yes, we are connected on this world through ecology, but also through imperialism. So this question of how do you turn from ally to accomplice, I think about, I have half my family is still in Guahan, while the other half is here in the continent. And the thing that's connecting us right now outside of our culture is that US military occupation is like a deathly force. And right now there's a huge movement going on in Guahan titled Putela Texan. And I just want to say I've only done research on the movement and no community members and family members part of the movement, but I'm not actively on the ground, so I just, again, want to name that positionality. But the Putela Texan movement really originated with these new US military infrastructural plans that were proposed, I believe, in a little earlier than 2010. But basically what happened was the US military was getting kicked out of Okinawa, and they kind of the US media kind of hushed it, but they were getting kicked out because they contaminated the water source in Okinawa, and there was a high rate of sexual abuse and gender-based violence while the US military was there. And these are very complex issues. I'm not overlooking the nuances, but that's just the overall nature of that incident. So basically what happened was the US military and the DoD proposed that they first proposed that 17,000 people, so military personnel and their dependents, would move from Okinawa to Guam, right? And then when that got shut down because of the protest, they moved it down to, I believe, about 7,000, which was mostly military personnel and maybe 2,000 dependents. That being said, the point I'm trying to make here is that some of the U.S. military infrastructural developments is going to be located in this place called the northern, northwest base, basically the northeast part of the island, and it sits on top of the largest water source in Guam that gives water to 90% of the residents. And to build a military ammunition testing site there would contaminate the water source, which would ultimately poison 90% of the island. So that being said, as much as there is an ecological relationship, a cultural relationship between people here in the continent and also in Guam, there's also this, unfortunate shared reality of U.S. imperialism. And for me, as someone who lived in the continent, I see my transition from the ally to the accomplice, or being in solidarity, whatever language people want to use, to really be very vocal, being here in the continent, about U.S. imperialism in the Pacific, and how that's a reality within the Pacific in general, historically and contemporarily. So I think I'll just kind of leave it at that.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll also add, not to be a plug, but I will plug that there is actually an exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery at the Smithsonian right now about U.S. imperialism in 1898 that looks at Hawaii, Guam, Puerto Rico. And so I think, what I'm hearing in this conversation today is, of course, the connecting of dots between a historical circumstance that has continued into our contemporary experience, and how we can reflect on that and understand those conditions, and then see ourselves in that transmission of knowledge and the activism that it'll take in order to continue, right? And so, to go back to our friends on Zoom, thinking about the importance of seeing that knowledge transmission through the stories and the way that that's retained in the weaving and the different practices is so important, because then people will be connected to those practices through a material culture that is not ephemeral. It'll be there, it'll last, and you have the chance of different generations being able to see themselves in creating, contemporary pieces that are informed by ancestral knowledge and those ecological connections, even though in undeniable fashion, environmental and degradation and militarization have meant mass migration out of the Pacific. I live in Hawaii, and certainly we are home to many, environmental refugees. But so I do want to look to our colleagues here who are joining via Zoom and ask maybe if they would like to share a little bit about how they see, the continuity of their culture as it takes place, not only through the materials, but also through the different generations and the connections between, elders and young people living in Arkansas today.
Fue importante que hubiéramos todo un tiempo.
don't know kalaman na kaya ako pwede naman yung sabi na ako
So yeah, it's a big difference for us here living in the Arkansas, especially the difference between elders and children nowadays. We are losing we're losing our language with our younger generation. And as for the elders, they really want us to continue and not lose our language. And they're excited that, they come to the U.S. and learn and get more knowledge, education, and all that. But then they also try to, remember that, we still have our culture, we still have our language, and try to keep them to continue using the language. But it is hard with all these kids now. They're mostly speaking English compared to our Marshallese language.
Yeah, thank you. You remind me of a conversation that I had with an artist named Tiokasin Ghost Horse. And he was explaining to me that in language, it's not just the words, but there's an orientation that the language can direct a person. How a person is oriented to the land, sort of like what you were saying about that we eat, that which feeds, and then we feed the land. And he was also explaining that within the language, there's so much more in terms of lessons just by understanding the structure of the language, aside from like the proverbs that are passed on in the language. And so I was wondering maybe if Kuma Ramsay, you want to maybe share a little bit about, that aspect of language revitalization and orientation toward the land by way of that education?
No, thank you, and I thank the previous speakers for that, because for us, the concept, think about the word communication. The root word in communication is to commune. And fundamentally, the language that our ancestors and our elders have passed on was a very spiritual language, and it was an elemental language. So every sound utterance is actually tied to a spiritual entity or element, which means when you utter the sound with intention and with emotion, as Auntie Pelahi, my kupuna and elder mentor, taught me, the seeds of thought are watered by the emotions of heart. And when you express that thought and that emotion on the life-giving breath of Ha, which is the word for life breath, you've now given that life, and you can't bring it back. And so when we're capturing the spiritual elements around us, we're not talking to one another. The whole purpose wasn't to talk to people. It was to talk to the environment. It was to commune with the environment, the fire, the air, the water, the spirit, the land. Because it's in that communion that you begin to thrive. It begins to thrive. And so the language is not a label, as we say, but it is a description. And it's prescriptive, descriptive, and yes, even subscriptive. It tells you how to behave. It tells you where to do it. It tells you how to do it. And it's more than just a singularity, right? A noun is a verb is an adverb. It's much more than just a single word, and it's often very contextual, right? So when we say pono, it's appropriate, it's proper for this time, but tomorrow that same word may be something different. I'm holding a job object in my hand and someone says, "What is that? What do you call that?" And you might say, "Well, it depends if it's Wednesday or if it's Friday. If I'm throwing it at you or if I'm sitting it on the floor." Its function is what we name it. We don't have a singular name for it. It's relational, once again. And it's subject to natural and spiritual intelligence and not just artificial intelligence. It ties to natural time versus artificial time, spiritual time. So the language, it's much more functional than perhaps we would use in the continental mindset of labeling things and looking for singularities. And so I think it's a very powerful way to understand ourselves and one another as to why the ethos of imperialism or anything else might take place, simply because how we communicate. And if I don't consider it, land, or something to be of equal or greater status than me, I'm going to treat it differently, right? It doesn't have the same reverence. And I think in the continental language, we use it for reference, but in the island reference, we use it for reverence. So from reference to reverence, the language allows us to make that spiritual jump and leap. So I hope that kind of ties into some of the things we've been talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Should I just jump in? Man, I'm getting thrown back to childhood when I was still living in Tacoma. So it's interesting, right? Because even the word epistemology, its root word is episteme, which means the order of things. So just how things operate. I think we can also translate that to relationality, right? The way things and people and land are in relationship to each other. That being said, something just popped up in my head. There's this word, right? It's an essence, I guess. It's a cultural value. It's called Tsinsuli. Tsinsuli is how you say it. And, I try my best to translate these into English, but the essence doesn't translate, right? Because, like you said, words are a discourse. It shapes the ways things are in relationship to each other. Now, being in, I call it the colonial metropole, so being in the continent, Tsinsuli, within a capitalist culture, within a neoliberal culture, people often consider that like giving money, right? Reciprocity, you give money to each other. But the way that the kind of origins of Tsinsuli was really based off this idea that if I help you today, you help me tomorrow, right? And if you're interested in looking more up on that, there's a really great historian. I think he's at the Guam History Museum right now, Michael Lujan Bavakwa, who I follow all his stuff, and he's a great historian of Guam. But yeah, he talks about this idea that like it translates within this capitalist order of knowledge to giving money to each other. But Tsinsuli is way bigger than that. It's this idea that whether you give it in the form of food or labor, right, within ancient times and even contemporary times in Guam, it's more about giving your full self. That's not just in this transactional nature around money, which, money is always needed, but money is a certain language that's different than, giving your full self in the holistic sense. So yeah, I think about that word Tsinsuli and how the essence of it, it's a word, right? But it's bigger than just saying reciprocity, because that can mean a lot of different things. There's this relational component behind it that can't just be translated into a word. It's translated through an entire relationship, as everyone here has been talking about.
And if I may,
yeah,
I think a lot of it has to do with our own metaphors, right? So
that's true.
Our experiences and what we think of the world, back to epistemology, really begins to shift the currencies of exchange. At a recent conversation we had, we actually identified language as a technology. Right? It's how we relate to things and see, but it's a technology. And for all intents and purposes, before there was such a thing called money, that was the currency of exchange, right? The whole language, right? Because it allowed you then to figure out who you were, where you were, and what we were exchanging. The first exchange started with words, if not some physical symbol or sign like waving, because I can't speak to you, it's safe to come into my house now. Right? Versus shaking your hand and knowing that I don't have a sword in it. But as we got farther away, we started going to these other signs, and then we started talking. So, I think it is a currency of some kind. And one of the chiefly, characteristics of a good chief in Hawaii was oratory, right? It wasn't just your physical skill or capacity, but it was how well you also used your words, because that's where influence comes from. And finally, when you don't have that influence, we revert to the lowest form of communication, which is violence. So I think if we elevate that currency and begin to look at it in these different ways again, language is a very powerful technology and tool for us to recapture, not just as labels, but as ways of relating to one another.
Well, okay, so to embrace all of that, both the reciprocity aspect and the opening up in language, we want to open up the conversation and invite questions in these last few minutes that we have for our discussion. If there is anyone who has a question, please stand up. We welcome you into the conversation.
Is anyone online? Are there online questions?
Good question. Do we have any online participants with questions? Yes.
Yeah.
That's a great question, and I'm going to invite the folks on Zoom to respond. So the question is, what type of material practices are we looking to revitalize and maintain in order to pass them on? Did I get that question correct? Yes, 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 that's the question.
So we need to break the balance. So to continue to be
So there's a lot of other stuff that other practices that we could refer to instead of materials that we can't bring from home. For example, plywoods, woods, we could make our canoes out of them, small canoes. I know for crystal bridges, Litha used plywoods that we bought from Home Depot to make a 14-feet canoe, which you guys will see tomorrow and the rest of the days. Also, live plants, we also could weave those to make headbands and that too. If we don't get anything from home, any material from home.
I'm also going to point out the jewelry that you're wearing, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, that is one of the things that is the continuity of the adornments that I see other folks who are here, the carvers who I've met while I've been at the festival, you know, are wearing similar types of adornments, and that seems to be another way to be able to maintain the weaving practices and these materials in a way that's on a scale that can travel and can, you know, be very visible and multi-generational. And
that is correct. Most of our weavers also share their talents with other islands and other nationality. Like for example, our headpieces. Clara is wearing one earlier, but we'll show that maybe throughout the festival. But other islanders and other, what do I say? We noticed other people are wearing and also making them.
so, I mean, that introduces another thing, right? And that is inviting others to participate in the continuity of culture and production of culture. And so on that note, I want to invite everyone here to join me in thanking our presenters today. And I just want to extend my own personal thanks to all of you, Nathan, Kuma Ramsay, and then our colleagues here Clara, Litha, and Luisa for joining today and coming with your full self and sharing in a very public way. And then I also just want to remind folks to continue to stay informed on activities and programs related to the festival. You want to go to festival.si.edu. And then the festival runs until 5:30. And so the last session of the day will run from 5 o'clock to 5:30 p.m. And so please continue to join us. Look forward to seeing you all as we share in the cultural exchange over the next couple of weeks. Thank you.
Aloha.
Hello, and thank you for moderation.
Yeah.